I'm going to also respond to the three questions that Ruth mentioned. Firstly, what are the characteristics and ideals of democracy? For me, the ideals of democracy are very different from anything that we have now. For me, the ideals of democracy are collective freedom and autonomy, or what I would call egalitarian liberty or equal liberty. And I think this is very different from most of the standard definitions of democracy that you find in political theory textbooks, for instance. Where democracy is usually seen as simply a form of popular sovereignty. What I'm proposing here is related to this idea of popular sovereignty, but it might be seen as an extension or a radicalization of this idea. In other words, a thinking of democracy to its ultimate conclusion. So let's look at the concept, firstly, of popular democracy. What do we actually mean by it? In most understandings, it's a part of society which is excluded or suppressed or denied their rights, the conflict between the demos and what he calls the police order. And this is the sort of the rationalist ordering of society in which individuals are assigned their places within a social hierarchy. And this conflict emerges when the system which formally guarantees rights to everyone, at the same time in practice denies rights to certain groups of people. And when that conflict becomes evident, that's when you have some kind of flickering, if you like, of democracy. So for him, democracy has nothing to do with a certain kind of regime of power. On the contrary, it's something which actually opposes this regime of power in the name of something which is more universal and more transcendent. And I think, I think for the most part, I'm very much in agreement with Ross here on this issue. I think that we should look for democracy not in the formal corridors of power, not in parliaments, not in electoral systems. We should look for democracy in the kind of politics which goes on outside the state. So, protests, social movements, militant trade union activity, direct action, grassroots community action, and so on. I think that's where one should look for manifestations of democracy. I would also like to suggest that ultimately, when thought through as to its logical conclusion, democracy is something which is irreconcilable with the very principle of state sovereignty. I'm just going to read you a quote from the 19th century Russian anarchist Bakunin. Bakunin says, in quotes, "Equality of political rights, or a democratic state, constitute in themselves the most glaring contradiction in terms. The state, or political right, denotes force, authority, predominance. It presupposes inequality, in fact. Where all rule, there are no more ruled and there is no state. Where all equally enjoy the same human rights, there all political right loses its reason for being." So the argument is that the democratic state is a contradiction. Why? Because to have a state and to have sovereignty already presupposes an inequality of power. In other words, if you have a principle of state sovereignty, this is an egalitarian principle, because it's saying that the state, as a power, orders this democratic society, and therefore it's not a democracy. So, in other words, the equality of political rights for Bakunin is actually irreconcilable with the idea of political right, or in other words, sovereignty. Okay, let me have a look at let me try to answer the second question. In the light of this understanding, to what extent are these ideals evident in modern society? Well, for me, the thing that revealed the most it revealed the absolute chasm between reality and between the ideals of democracy. And I'm not just talking about my sort of radical ideals, I'm talking about even just the kind of a standard sort of notion, a standard kind of textbook notion of democracy. The thing that revealed the absolute chasm for me was the protests in 2003 against the war in Iraq. You had these massive global protests. You had 1 million people marching here in London against the war in 2003, protests in New York, Los Angeles, all around the world, in fact, only to be met with the absolute indifference and utter contempt of our political masters. Here was a situation where the voice of the people was literally shut out from access to power. Actually, quite literally, because they brought in this 1 kilometre of exclusion zone as a response to these protests. So you couldn't actually legally have a protest within a 1 kilometre radius of Westminster. And this really symbolised for me this kind of real divide between, you know, the reality of our kind of authoritarian post-democracies and any kind of ideal of democracy. The second event, which kind of symbolised this absolute separation, was something which was slightly less dramatic, but I think still very interesting. Tony Blair in 2006, when he was looking back on his reign, he said in a TV interview that God would judge him on his decision to go to war in Iraq, reflecting some of the comments that have been previously made, similar comments have been made by George Bush. So in other words, Tony Blair doesn't answer to the people, he answers to God. It would seem that the old doctrine of the divine right of kings has actually made a strange, uncanny comeback in our so-called democracy today. So I think these instances kind of reveal the true crisis of democracy and its terminal decline. What I would suggest is that democracy is transforming itself into a kind of an authoritarian, post-democratic and post-liberal kind of regime. I think the very semblance of democracy, of democratic legitimacy, of the will of the people and of transparency is starting to fall away. And I think what's being revealed here is what Carl Schmitt refers to as the sovereign state of exception. So a number of things indicate what I'm talking about. We have, for instance, the globalization of the ideology of democracy. What I mean by that is we actually had an administration under George Bush which was actually claiming to export a certain model of democracy to the rest of the world through military means, if necessary. Export it to people who were simply, in George Bush's eyes, crying out for American-style democracy. Obviously, it was only a very limited form of democracy that they were claiming to export, and pretty much boiled down to the free market, which pretty much boiled down again to the interests of American corporations. And I suggest you actually have a look at Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, where she talks about the way in which the war on terror is basically being used as a weapon of neoliberal economics and neoliberal ideology. But nevertheless, we have this kind of ideology of democracy which coincides with the absolute crisis of democracy back here in the West. And I think there's kind of a link between the two. I mean, obviously we can point to a number of structural problems, disillusionment, falling levels of voter turnout, the collapse of any kind of meaningful distinction between left and right, the distorting influence of the media on the democratic process. The absolute convergence, I think, of the media and politics is symbolised by someone like Silvio Berlusconi, TV tycoon, who's once again Prime Minister in Italy, in alliance with various fascist parties and political forces. And so he kind of symbolises this sort of convergence, really, this blurring between the media and politics. Politics gets around the problem of media transparency by simply becoming the media. Okay? Politics becomes the media becomes politics.